Everyone thinks SpongeBob's cast has stayed the same goofy crew since 1999. Same jobs, same friendships, same jokes. The fandom's own character wikis would tell you otherwise. They have spent years quietly tracking how far these characters drifted from where they started. And that is exactly why, in this video, we're going to find out which character in Bikini Bottom actually morphed the most. The premise. What morphing means here. SpongeBob SquarePants is one of the longest running cartoons on television, and it has been on the air for more than 25 years. The show first came on Nickelodeon on May 1st, 1999. It was created by a man named Steven Hillenburg, who used to be a marine biology teacher before he became an animator. He first pitched the idea for the show to Nickelodeon back in 1997, 2 years before it actually aired. When he was putting the cast together, he reached out to a voice actor named Tom Kenny, who he had already worked with on an earlier cartoon called Rocko's Modern Life. Tom Kenny ended up being the voice of SpongeBob himself, a role he has now played for over 2.5 decades. Since that first episode aired, the show has grown into something much bigger than anyone probably expected back in 1999. As of the middle of 2026, the series has produced more than 330 half-hour episodes spread across 17 seasons, and it is still making new episodes today. Along the way, it has also grown into movies, spin-off shows, comic books, and a huge amount of merchandise. Very few cartoons ever reach this kind of lifespan. Most animated shows get a handful of seasons before they end, but SpongeBob has kept going for so long that it has actually outlived some of its own audience's assumptions about how long a cartoon can realistically run. When a show sticks around for this many years, something interesting starts to happen to its characters. The people writing new episodes are almost never the exact same people who wrote the earliest ones. Tastes change, audiences change, the people running the show change. Over at SpongeBob, the very first showrunner was Steven Hillenburg himself, but after a while, a man named Paul Tibbitt took over running the day-to-day writing and direction of the show, holding that job for about a decade. Later on, 2 other people named Mark Ceccarelli and Vincent Waller stepped into that same kind of leading role. Each time the people steering the show change, even a little bit, the way a character gets written can shift too, sometimes without anyone even meaning for it to happen. This idea, a cartoon character slowly turning into a different version of themselves over the years, is what this whole video is going to dig into. The purpose here is not to just say the show got worse or better over time. That kind of opinion gets thrown around online constantly, and it does not really explain anything. Instead, this video is going to look closely at the actual characters themselves, compare who they were when the show started to who they became many seasons later, and figure out which one of them changed the most. Before getting into any single character, it helps to understand what this kind of change actually looks like and where it comes from. A cartoon character is not a real person. A real person has thousands of tiny qualities that make them who they are, built up over an entire lifetime of experiences. A cartoon character is much simpler than that. Writers usually build a character out of a small handful of clear traits, because those traits need to be understandable within a 22-minute episode, and often within just a few seconds of screen time. SpongeBob is cheerful and eager. Squidward is grumpy and wants to be left alone. Patrick is easygoing and not very sharp. Mr. Krabs cares about money. Sandy is proud of being tough and smart. Plankton wants to steal a formula and take over the restaurant business. These are simple starting points, and they work extremely well for a comedy show because the audience can understand a character almost instantly just by watching them react to a situation. The problem, if you can call it a problem, is that once a show runs for hundreds of episodes, writers start looking for new jokes using those same starting traits. If Mr. Krabs loving money got a laugh in season 1, it is an easy target to lean on again in season 5, and again in season 10, and again in season 15. Each time a writer reaches for that same trait to build a new joke, there is a small temptation to push it a little further than the last time, just to make sure the joke still lands with an audience who has already seen dozens of episodes about a crab who likes money. Over enough years, that gentle pushing can add up. The trait that used to be one piece of a full character can slowly turn into almost the entire character. Fans and critics who talk about cartoons and other long-running shows actually have a specific word for this pattern. They call it Flanderization. The word comes from a character on a completely different show, The Simpsons. That character is named Ned Flanders, a neighbor of the main family who started out as a fairly normal, friendly, and religious man. As the Simpsons kept running year after year, the writers leaned harder and harder into just his religious side, until that one trait eventually became almost the entire character, pushing out most of the other qualities he originally had. Fans noticed this pattern happening to Ned Flanders so clearly that they started using his name as a general term for any character who slowly gets boiled down to one exaggerated trait. Once that word existed, people started applying it to characters on plenty of other shows too, including the cast of SpongeBob. It is worth being clear about something here. Saying a character has been Flanderized is not really an insult aimed at any single writer, artist, or actor. Nobody sits down at the start of a season and decides to ruin a character on purpose. What actually happens is more like a slow drift, spread out across many different writers, many different episodes, and many years of a show trying to keep finding new jokes using a cast the audience already knows well. It happens because a returning trait is reliable. It happens because a network wants episodes that keep pulling in an audience. It happens because after so many episodes, a completely calm and balanced version of a character can start to feel less exciting to write than a louder, more exaggerated version of the same character. None of that requires anyone to be doing something wrong. It is simply a common pattern that shows up again and again in long-running television, especially in comedies that lean on a small group of characters for hundreds of episodes. Among people who watch and talk about SpongeBob online, this idea has become extremely common. It is widely accepted within the fan community that basically every member of the show's main cast has changed in this way to some degree. Some fans point to Mr. Krabs and the way his love of money slowly grew from a personality quirk into something close to his entire identity. Other fans point to Patrick and the way his easygoing, occasionally clever personality slowly narrowed down into a character mostly known for being extremely dim-witted. Others bring up Squidward, Plankton, or even SpongeBob himself. Almost nobody argues that zero characters changed. The real argument, the one that does not have one single agreed-upon answer, is about which character changed the most. And that disagreement is exactly what makes this such an interesting question to dig into. To understand why this comparison is even worth making, it helps to remember what Bikini Bottom actually looked like back when the show started, because that starting point is the measuring stick everything else in this video will be compared against. Bikini Bottom is an underwater town, and the show follows a small group of characters who all know each other and mostly work or live near one another. SpongeBob himself lives in a pineapple and works as a fry cook at a restaurant called the Krusty Krab, flipping burgers called Krabby Patties. His neighbor and co-worker is Squidward, who works the cash register at that same restaurant and would honestly rather be doing almost anything else with his time. The restaurant is owned by Mr. Krabs, a crab who built the business himself and cares deeply about how much money it brings in. Across the street sits a much smaller restaurant called the Chum Bucket, owned by a tiny creature named Plankton, who has spent years trying to steal the secret formula for Krabby Patties so his own restaurant can finally compete. SpongeBob's best friend is Patrick, a starfish who lives under a rock and spends most of his time relaxing. Rounding out the main group is Sandy, a squirrel from Texas who lives in an air-filled dome underwater so she can survive, and who prides herself on being both physically tough and scientifically smart. That basic setup, a fry cook, his grumpy coworker, their money-focused boss, a rival restaurant owner, a laid-back best friend, and a tough visiting squirrel, has stayed the same for the entire run of the show. Nobody moved away. Nobody got a brand new job. The relationships between these characters have mostly stayed in the same shape for over 2 decades. What has not stayed the same, according to a large number of fans, critics, and even people who write essays and reviews about the show, is how each of these characters behaves within that same basic setup. The world stayed still. The people living in it did not. A lot of people who study or write about this shift point to a specific stretch of time as the moment things really started to change, and that stretch lines up with the release of the very first SpongeBob movie back in 2004. Before that movie came out, the show's humor tended to be a little quieter and a little stranger, built more around odd situations and gentle character quirks. After the movie, according to a large number of fans and critics, the overall tone of the show got louder, more exaggerated, and in some cases a lot meaner between characters than it used to be. This does not mean every single episode before 2004 was calm and every episode after was wild, because plenty of exceptions exist in both directions. But as a general pattern, that stretch of time is where a lot of people mark the beginning of the bigger personality shifts this video is going to explore. It is also worth mentioning that the timeline of behind-the-scenes changes at the show adds another layer to this story. Steven Hillenburg passed away on November 26, 2018, after having already stepped back from directly running the show years earlier while still staying involved as an executive producer. Fans sometimes bring up this kind of leadership change when they talk about why a long-running show's tone can shift over the years, since new people in charge naturally bring their own instincts about what makes a scene funny or what a character should do in a given moment. That said, this video is not going to lean on guessing about anyone's personal intentions behind the scenes. The focus here stays on what actually shows up on screen, episode after episode, because that is the part that can be checked and compared directly. So here is the actual plan for the rest of this video. Each of the next several sections is going to take one specific character from the main cast and lay out two things clearly. First, how that character behaved and talked and reacted to situations back in the earlier seasons of the show. Second, how that same character behaves in the later seasons, once the exaggerated version of their personality had fully taken over. By doing this one character at a time, it becomes possible to actually compare them side by side, instead of just repeating the general idea that everybody changed. Some characters, it turns out, only shifted in small ways. Others changed so much that a person watching an early episode and a later episode back to back might have a hard time believing it is even the same character. Mr. Krabs is going to be one of the biggest cases looked at here, since his change from a mostly reasonable, if money-minded business owner into a much harsher and more extreme version of himself is one of the most talked about examples in the entire show. Patrick is another major case, partly because his change did not happen in one simple straight line. Instead, his personality shifted, then shifted back somewhat, and then shifted again in a different direction, which makes his story a little more complicated than a simple before and after comparison. Squidward's situation is different still, since a lot of the conversation around him focuses less on his personality changing and more on how his role within the show's episodes narrowed down into a smaller handful of repeating situations. Plankton went through a change that is almost the opposite of Krabs, moving from a competent and confident villain into someone many fans grew to feel sorry for instead of afraid of. Even SpongeBob himself, the character the whole show is named after, has not been treated as untouchable by this pattern, with some fans arguing that his own ambition and drive faded compared to where he started. Laying all of this out side by side is really the whole point of this exercise. Instead of picking a favorite character and building an argument backward to support that pick, this video is going to walk through each character using their own actual history within the show, one season era at a time, and let the amount of change speak for itself. By the time every character has been covered, there should be enough evidence sitting on the table to make a real comparison instead of a guess. There is one more thing worth saying before moving into the first character's story. None of this is meant to suggest that the newer seasons of the show have no value, or that everyone involved with making those later episodes did something wrong. Plenty of viewers still enjoy modern episodes, and plenty of specific episodes from the so-called changed eras of the show are still considered genuinely funny or clever by large parts of the fan base. The goal of this video is not to rank eras of the show as good or bad. The goal is much narrower than that. It is simply to trace how far each character drifted from where they started, and to figure out, using their actual on-screen behavior, which one of them ended up the furthest from home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With that groundwork laid out, the next step is to go back to where it all began, for the character most people bring up first whenever this topic comes up at all. Before he became known across the internet as one of the most extreme examples of a character being pushed to an extreme, he was something very different, something a lot more grounded, something that barely resembles the version of him that so many newer viewers grew up watching instead. Section 2, Mr. Krabs, Seasons 1 to 5, the baseline. Before looking at how far Mr. Krabs eventually drifted from where he started, it helps to get a clear and honest picture of where he actually started. A lot of casual conversations about this topic tend to describe early Mr. Krabs as a kind, gentle boss who somehow turned mean later on, but that is not quite accurate. The real starting point is a little more complicated than that, and getting it right matters because the whole point of this comparison depends on knowing exactly what changed and what stayed the same. Mr. Krabs is the owner and founder of the Krusty Krab, the restaurant restaurant where SpongeBob works as a fry cook and Squidward works the register. He built the business himself, he employs both of them, and he has a long-running rivalry with a tiny creature named Plankton, who owns a much smaller and much less successful restaurant called the Chum Bucket, directly across the street. Mr. Krabs is also a father, raising his daughter Pearl, who happens to be a whale despite him being a crab, something the show has never bothered to explain and never needed to. From the very first handful of seasons, Mr. Krabs already loved money. This part of him was never invented later on. It was built into the character from close to the beginning. One of the clearest early examples shows up in an episode called Squid on Strike, which aired in October of 2001 during the show's second season. The episode opens with Mr. Krabs sitting in his office doing his accounting, clearly enjoying the process of counting up his earnings for the day. When he notices that his profits have dropped by a small amount compared to the month before, he decides the business needs to tighten its belt, and he comes up with a plan to start charging his own employees small fees for things that should obviously be free, like talking to customers, chewing gum, or simply existing inside the building. Squidward finds this completely unfair and convinces SpongeBob to join him in going on strike to protest the new rules. SpongeBob does not even understand what going on strike means at first, and he is honestly devastated when he ends up losing his job over it, since he loves working there so much that being fired feels like a much bigger loss to him than any of the new fees ever did. This episode is worth spending time on because it shows something important about who Mr. Krabs was in these early years. His love of money was already extreme enough to build an entire episode around, but the story around it still worked the way a normal sitcom plot works. His decision to charge fees for breathing and talking was clearly meant to be a joke about how far a cheap boss might go, not a realistic threat that was supposed to feel dangerous or cruel in a serious way. The joke landed because audiences already know what a stingy manager looks like in real life, and the episode simply pushed that familiar idea to a funny extreme. By the end of the episode, the situation gets resolved through consequences and mistakes on both sides, not through Mr. Krabs simply winning by hurting people and walking away without consequences. Another early episode that shows this same pattern is called Graveyard Shift, which aired less than a year after Squid on Strike, also during season 2. In this episode, Mr. Krabs decides the Krusty Krab should stay open all night, and he forces both SpongeBob and Squidward to work an entire 24-hour shift without a break. This is clearly an unfair and unreasonable demand from a boss, and nobody watching the episode is meant to think it is a nice thing to do. At the same time, the episode is not really about Mr. Krabs being cruel for its own sake. Most of the episode's actual plot focuses on Squidward trying to scare SpongeBob with a ghost story to get him to leave early, only for the ghost story's events to start seeming like they might actually be happening. Mr. Krabs sets up the unfair situation at the start, but the story that follows is not really about him at all. He is the reason the two of them are stuck at work overnight, but the comedy and tension of the episode come from what SpongeBob and Squidward do with that situation, not from watching Mr. Krabs enjoy their suffering. This distinction matters a lot for this comparison. In both of these early episodes, Mr. Krabs does something that is clearly selfish and clearly puts his own profits ahead of his employees. Nobody could honestly claim that early Mr. Krabs was a saintly, generous boss who cared about nothing but his workers' happiness. That version of him never existed. What is different in these early years is how the show treats that selfishness. It gets used as the spark that starts a story, and then the story moves on to focus on other things, like Squidward's plan going wrong, or SpongeBob's reaction to an unfamiliar situation. Mr. Krabs causes the problem, but he is rarely the one the camera lingers on to enjoy how much damage he can cause. The low pay that both SpongeBob and Squidward received working at the Krusty Krab is another detail worth being precise about, because it actually stayed fairly consistent across the entire show, rather than being something that changed dramatically over time. Multiple episodes across many different seasons describe SpongeBob and Squidward earning very little money for their work, sometimes far below what would count as a fair wage in the real world. This means the joke about Mr. Krabs underpaying his staff was not something invented later to make him seem worse. It was baked into the show from close to the very beginning and simply kept getting reused across the years, which actually makes it one of the more stable parts of his character, rather than one of the parts that drifted the furthest. At the same time, it is worth noting that the show was not always perfectly consistent about this detail either. another. In at least one earlier episode, Squidward specifically says that Mr. Krabs pays him minimum wage, which does not exactly match the extremely low pay described elsewhere in the show. This kind of small contradiction is actually pretty normal for a long-running cartoon, since different writers working on different episodes years apart do not always check every earlier episode before writing a new one. It is a small detail, but it is worth mentioning here because it shows that even some of Mr. Krabs' more famous traits were not always handled with perfect consistency, even within these earlier seasons that most fans consider his more grounded era. Alongside these selfish and cheap moments, the earlier seasons also gave Mr. Krabs room to be shown as a reasonably competent business owner who understood how to run a restaurant and compete with a rival. His ongoing conflict with Plankton across these years usually plays out as a fairly even competition between two business owners, rather than a one-sided situation where Mr. Krabs simply crushes a weaker opponent for entertainment. Plankton spends these years trying to steal the secret formula for Krabby Patties, using various clever inventions and schemes, and Mr. Krabs generally responds by protecting his restaurant and his recipe using ordinary business instincts, like locking up the formula carefully or catching Plankton in the act. This version of their rivalry treats both characters as being on somewhat equal footing, which is very different from how some later seasons handle the same relationship. Mr. Krabs' relationship with his daughter Pearl during these years also gives a fuller picture of who he was outside of his job. Even though money is clearly important to him, the show does not present him as someone who only cares about his bank account and nothing else. He is shown caring about Pearl's well-being and her place in his life as a father, which adds a layer to his personality beyond just being a boss who is obsessed with profit. This does not erase his greedy side, but it does mean that greed was only one part of a more complete character during these years, not the entire foundation his whole personality rested on. Taken together, these early seasons paint a picture of a character who was already flawed, already cheap, and already capable of doing selfish things that put his employees in unfair situations. He was never a perfect boss, and nobody looking honestly at these seasons could argue otherwise. What he was not yet, in these first several years of the show, was a character defined entirely by that one trait, to the point where almost everything else about him faded into the background. His greed existed alongside business sense, alongside fatherly concern for Pearl, and alongside a rivalry with Plankton that still felt like a fair fight between two competing restaurant owners, rather than one side simply tormenting the other. The joke of Mr. Krabs loving money worked because it was one ingredient mixed in with several others, not the entire recipe on its own. This baseline is the version of Mr. Krabs that a lot of longtime fans think back to when they talk about missing the earlier years of the show. It is a flawed character, but a balanced one. Someone whose selfish moments felt like an exaggerated version of a familiar type of person, rather than a cartoon villain. Episodes built around his cheapness, like the two described here, still worked because the show trusted the audience to laugh at the exaggeration without needing Mr. Krabs to become genuinely frightening or cruel in order to get that laugh. The joke was always that he loved money a little too much for his own good, not that he was willing to hurt the people around him without a second thought. Keeping this starting point clearly in mind is important going forward, because the next stretch of the show's history is going to test exactly how far that same basic trait could be pushed before something in the character's overall shape started to break. The same love of money that fueled small, self-contained jokes about fees and long shifts in these earlier years did not stay the same size forever. Somewhere between these grounded early seasons and the era that came right after them, that one ingredient started taking up a lot more room on the plate, and the character built around it started looking less and less like the boss described here. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What happens next to Mr. Krabs is the part of his story that most fans actually bring up first whenever his name comes up in conversations about this topic. It is the stretch of episodes where his love of money stopped sharing space with his other traits, and instead started pushing almost everything else out of the frame entirely, turning small jokes about fees and long shifts into something a lot larger and a lot harder to laugh off so easily. Section 3. Mr. Krabs, Seasons 6 to 10, The Turn. Before Season 6 even started, there were already a few early warning signs that the more extreme version of Mr. Krabs was possible within the show's show's world. One clear example shows up in an episode called Krabby Land, which actually aired back during Season 3 in 2004. In that episode, Mr. Krabs builds a run-down, unsafe playground made out of scraps and junk just to pull children away from a nicer, free playground and get their parents to spend money at his restaurant. He openly admits, right to SpongeBob, that he does not care about the children at all and only cares about the money their parents will spend. He forces SpongeBob to entertain the disappointed kids by hurting himself over and over, and the whole situation only gets resolved when the children discover his lie about a promised clown and take their money back from him directly. By the end of the episode, Mr. Krabs is punished for what he did. He gets force-fed lima beans and loses all the money he made from the scheme. This episode matters a lot for understanding what changed later, because it shows that the show was clearly capable of writing an extremely selfish version of Mr. Krabs, even in its earlier years. The difference is that in Season 3, this kind of behavior was still treated as an exception rather than the rule, and it still came with real consequences by the end of the episode. He got caught, he got punished, and the story made it clear that what he did was wrong. That pattern, doing something selfish and then facing a fair consequence for it, is what mostly disappears once the show moves into its 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th seasons. It helps to look at Krabby Land a little more closely, because the way this single episode is remembered by fans actually says something important about how rare this kind of behavior still was at the time. People who have written about this specific episode over the years frequently describe it as feeling out of place for its era, noting that this version of Mr. Krabs matches the exaggerated characters seen much more often in later seasons, rather than the more grounded character usually seen around it in Season 3. That word, out of place, is the key detail. An episode standing out as unusual within its own season is very different from an episode fitting naturally into a season built almost entirely around that same tone. Krabby Land stood out precisely because episodes like it were still rare in 2004. A few years later, that same basic behavior would stop standing out entirely because it would simply become part of the ordinary rhythm of the show. Starting around Season 6, a change becomes noticeable in just how often Mr. Krabs behaves this way, and in how the show treats it once he does. What used to be an occasional extreme moment, usually followed by some kind of punishment or lesson, starts showing up far more often and starts ending without much punishment at all. His love of money stops being one trait sitting next to his other qualities, like his fatherly concern for Pearl or his fair-minded rivalry with Plankton, and instead becomes something closer to the only thing that defines him in a huge number of episodes during this stretch. This particular stretch of seasons also happens to line up closely with a specific period of behind-the-scenes leadership at the show. A man named Paul Tibbitt served as showrunner from 2006 through 2016, meaning he was in charge of guiding the show's overall direction for the entire run of seasons that this section focuses on. This does not mean any single person can be blamed for every individual choice made across 5 full seasons of television, since dozens of different writers, directors, and animators worked on these episodes across those years. It is still worth mentioning simply as a piece of accurate historical context, since it shows that this stretch of the show's history was overseen by a single, consistent leadership team for its entire length, rather than being the product of constant turnover behind the scenes. Whatever caused Mr. Krabs' writing to shift so heavily during this period, it happened under one continuous creative direction, rather than through a rotating cast of different people, each making small, disconnected choices. The clearest and most talked about example of this shift comes from an episode called One Course Meal, which aired in March of 2010 during Season 7. This episode is one of the most discussed and most criticized episodes in the entire history of the show, and looking closely at what actually happens in it explains why. Plankton has spent years trying to steal the secret formula for Krabby Patties, using various inventions and schemes, and in this episode, Mr. Krabs accidentally discovers that Plankton is deeply afraid of whales, a fear that actually makes sense within the show's world, since it is mentioned that whales have historically eaten members of Plankton's family. Instead of simply using this fear once to scare Plankton off during a single break-in attempt, Mr. Krabs decides to put on a costume that makes him look like his daughter Pearl, who is a whale, and uses it to terrify Plankton again and again over what the show describes as roughly 2 full weeks. During this stretch, Plankton becomes seriously distressed. He starts having nightmares about being harmed by whales. His fear grows so extreme and lasts so long without any relief that at one point in the episode, he is shown lying down down in the middle of a road, apparently trying to end his own life by letting a bus run him over. SpongeBob happens to be nearby and stops him, and once Plankton finds out the truth, that the whale terrorizing him the whole time was actually Mr. Krabs in a costume, his fear turns into anger, and he gets a small piece of revenge by scaring Mr. Krabs using his own fear of mimes for the rest of the episode. Looking at how this episode is discussed by people who have reviewed it closely over the years adds another layer worth including here. Several reviewers who have gone through the episode scene by scene have pointed out that the opening portion, where Mr. Krabs first discovers the fear and starts using it against Plankton, is genuinely well put together, with a clear and energetic setup that explains exactly why he wants to take advantage of the situation. These same reviewers tend to note that the episode loses its footing once it moves past this opening stretch, becoming repetitive and increasingly uncomfortable to watch as the torment drags on far longer than the joke can really support. This kind of detailed criticism matters because it shows that the problem most viewers have with this episode is not simply that the initial premise was a bad idea. Plenty of earlier seasons had built entire episodes around one character learning and exploiting another character's weakness. The problem is specifically how far past a reasonable stopping point the show was willing to push that same familiar setup, and how little the story seemed to care about bringing things back into balance once it had gone that far. What makes this episode stand out so much within the larger conversation about Mr. Krabs is not just how far the joke about Plankton's fear was pushed, it is what happens and does not happen once the joke is over. Unlike Krabbyland, where Mr. Krabs clearly faced a real punishment for exploiting children, one-course meal ends without Mr. Krabs ever really answering for what he did. He is briefly annoyed by the mime that Plankton sends after him, but that is a fairly small and short-lived consequence compared to what he actually put Plankton through over 2 weeks. Nobody in the episode sits him down and tells him that what he did was wrong. He does not lose money the way he did in Krabbyland. He simply moves on. This lack of any real consequence is a big part of why so many fans and critics point to this specific episode as the clearest example of how far the character had drifted by this stretch of the show's run. Some people who have written extensively about this particular episode go a step further and argue that Mr. Krabs' actions here cross a kind of line that is difficult to walk back from within the logic of a comedy show built around a supposedly likable main cast. The idea behind this argument is that certain actions, once shown on screen without real consequence, permanently change how an audience is able to see a character going forward, since it becomes hard to fully separate a character's future lighthearted appearances from the memory of what they were once shown doing without any real remorse. Whether or not every viewer agrees with this specific way of framing it, the fact that so many people reach for this kind of language when discussing this one episode says something on its own about how far outside the show's usual comedic boundaries this particular storyline was seen as landing. It is also worth being fair and pointing out that even people who dislike this episode generally do not think the basic idea behind it was a bad one. The setup, where Mr. Krabs discovers a rival's secret fear and decides to use it against him, fits naturally with a rivalry that had existed between the two of them since the earliest seasons. The problem most viewers point to is not the idea itself, but how far the show was willing to take it, and how completely it let Mr. Krabs walk away from the situation without having to face anything close to a fair outcome. In earlier seasons, an episode built around one character exploiting another character's fear would have almost certainly ended with some kind of return consequence landing on the person who started it. In this episode, the return consequence is small, temporary, and mostly played for one more joke rather than as a real resolution. This same pattern of exaggerated behavior without much of a fair consequence shows up across a number of other episodes from this same stretch of seasons, based on how fans and people who study the show's history have described this era over the years. Mr. Krabs is shown across various episodes from this period, underpaying his employees even more aggressively than before, going out of his way to avoid paying them at all in some cases, and treating both SpongeBob and Squidward more like tools for making money than like people who work for him. Where earlier seasons balanced his cheapness against moments of real caring, like using his own money to cheer SpongeBob up when he was sad, this later stretch leans much harder into showing him willing to hurt, trick, or exploit almost anyone if it means protecting or growing his profits. There is also a broader, more measurable piece of evidence worth bringing into this discussion, one that does not come from any single episode at all. Audience rating numbers collected on large review platforms show a real drop in overall viewer satisfaction, landing on almost this exact stretch of seasons. The show's 6th season carries an audience approval score sitting around 60% on one widely used platform, down sharply from the much higher approval the earliest seasons received. The 8th season sits even a little lower than that, closer to 56%. These are not numbers pulled from a single critic's personal opinion. They reflect how a large number of ordinary viewers rated their experience watching these seasons after the fact. And the fact that this measurable dip lines up so closely with the exact stretch of episodes already singled out here for Mr. Krabs' harshest and least accountable behavior adds a layer of outside confirmation to everything already described. A change significant enough to show up in broad audience satisfaction numbers, not just in detailed fan discussions built around individual scenes, suggests that this shift in his character was large enough to be felt by a wide range of viewers, not only by people already looking closely for it. One of the clearest signs of how much this shift affected the way audiences saw Mr. Krabs shows up in how his long-running rivalry with Plankton changed shape during these same years. In the earlier seasons, this rivalry generally played out as two business owners of roughly equal footing trying to outdo each other, with Plankton scheming and Mr. Krabs defending his restaurant using ordinary business sense. During seasons 6 through 10, a lot of fans and critics who have written about the show started noticing that this balance had tipped. Plankton increasingly came across as a smaller, more harmless character whose schemes rarely worked and who often ended up the victim of situations rather than the one causing trouble, while Mr. Krabs increasingly came across as the one causing real harm. This shift got noticeable enough that many longtime viewers openly started saying they felt more sympathy for Plankton, the character who was originally introduced as the show's villain, than they did for Mr. Krabs, who was originally introduced as one of the show's more grounded supporting characters. This reversal becomes even easier to understand once Plankton's own backstory with Mr. Krabs is taken into account. An episode focused on how their rivalry originally began reveals that the two of them knew each other long before either restaurant existed, and that Plankton's resentment grew out of watching his own attempts at running a successful restaurant fail, while Mr. Krabs became genuinely successful at the exact same goal. Once this backstory is added to the picture, Mr. Krabs' harsher behavior during these later seasons starts to look even less sympathetic by comparison, since it shows him repeatedly using cruelty and manipulation against someone who is, underneath the surface, dealing with real insecurity about long-standing personal failure, rather than simply being a cartoonish villain with no depth at all. That particular change in how Plankton himself is written deserves its own full look later in this video, since his story runs in almost the opposite direction from Mr. Krabs. But it is worth mentioning here, because it shows just how far-reaching the effect of Mr. Krabs' shift actually was. It did not just change how one character behaved, it changed how an entire, long-running relationship between two characters felt to the people watching it. Taken together, the stretch of seasons 6 through 10 represents the point where Mr. Krabs' defining trait stopped sharing space with the rest of his personality, and instead started crowding almost everything else out. The fatherly warmth toward Pearl that showed up in earlier seasons becomes harder to find. The sense of him as a competent, if cheap, business owner running a fair rivalry with Plankton becomes harder to find. What replaces those things, according to the vast majority of fans, critics, and people who have written detailed breakdowns of this era, is a character whose decisions in episode after episode revolve almost entirely around money, often at the direct expense of the people around him, frequently without the kind of fair consequence that earlier seasons, like the one built around Krabbyland, had reliably provided. This does not mean every single episode from these 5 seasons focuses on Mr. Krabs behaving this way, since the show was still producing hundreds of segments across a wide range of storylines during this stretch, many of which barely feature him at all. What it does mean is that when episodes did put his personality front and center during these years, the version of him that showed up was consistently closer to the extreme version briefly glimpsed back in Krabbyland than to the more balanced version described in the earlier baseline seasons. What had once been an occasional exception became something closer to the expected version of the character, and that shift from exception to expectation is really the heart of what people mean when they say Mr. Krabs was Flanderized. Looking at this stretch of the show also raises an important question question that this video is going to keep coming back to with every character it covers. A single extreme episode does not automatically prove that a character has permanently changed, since almost every character on a long-running show ends up in at least one unusually intense situation, somewhere across hundreds of episodes. What actually shows a lasting change is a pattern, repeated across many different episodes and many different writers over several years, where the same extreme version of a character keeps showing up as the default, rather than as a rare exception. For Mr. Krabs, the evidence for that kind of lasting pattern during these 5 seasons is about as strong as it gets anywhere in the show, which is exactly why his story tends to come up first whenever this topic gets discussed among fans. The combination of specific episodes, like One Course Meal, the broader pattern of harsher treatment toward his employees, the reversal in how his rivalry with Plankton felt to longtime viewers, and the measurable dip in audience satisfaction scores across this same stretch all point toward the same basic conclusion from several completely different directions at once, which is a stronger foundation than any single piece of evidence could provide on its own. There is one more piece of the story worth setting up before moving away from Mr. Krabs for now. This video is not going to end his story here, in the middle of his most extreme stretch, because that would leave an incomplete picture. Several fans and people who track the show closely have pointed out that Mr. Krabs' character did not simply stay locked in this exaggerated shape forever. Later seasons of the show, occurring after this particularly intense stretch, are often described as walking some of this back, bringing him closer again to the more balanced version seen in the earliest years. Exactly how much of that earlier balance actually returned, and how convincingly, is a fair question worth digging into on its own. But that piece of his story fits better once every other character in this comparison has had their own turn first. For now, the picture of Mr. Krabs is complete enough to serve its purpose in this comparison. He started out as a flawed but balanced character whose greed shared space with real business sense and real warmth toward his daughter. Across seasons 6 through 10, that balance broke down, turning one part of him into nearly the whole of him, and turning a character who used to face fair consequences for his worst moments into one who mostly did not. Whether any other member of the main cast drifted this far from where they started is going to take a much closer look at each of them individually, starting with the character whose own transformation did not move in one simple direction at all, but instead zigzagged back and forth across the show's history in a way that makes his story quite a bit harder to sum up in a single sentence. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. For now, the picture of Mr. Krabs is complete enough to serve its purpose in this comparison. He started out as a flawed but balanced character whose greed shared space with real business sense and real warmth toward his daughter. Across seasons 6 through 10, that balance broke down, turning one part of him into nearly the whole of him, and turning a character who used to face fair consequences for his worst moments into one who mostly did not. Whether any other member of the main cast drifted this far from where they started is going to take a much closer look at each of them individually, starting with the character whose own transformation did not move in one simple direction at all, but instead zigzagged back and forth across the show's history in a way that makes his story quite a bit harder to sum up in a single sentence. Section 4. Patrick. Early seasons. Not just dumb. Patrick Star is SpongeBob's best friend and one of his 2 neighbors in Bikini Bottom, living under a rock a short distance from SpongeBob's pineapple. He is voiced by an actor named Bill Fagerbach, and he first appeared in the very first episode of the show, called Help Wanted, back in 1999. Over the years, Patrick has become one of the most recognized characters in the entire show, and if someone who has never watched a single episode were asked to describe him in one sentence, the answer they would probably give involves the word dumb. That reputation is not something the show invented out of nowhere. Patrick has always been written as easygoing, laid back, and not particularly sharp when it comes to schoolwork or formal thinking. What gets left out of that simple summary, though, is that in the earlier seasons of the show, this same character was written with a lot more range than people usually give him credit for, and looking closely at some specific early episodes shows exactly what that range looked like. It is worth pausing on where Patrick actually came from before looking at what he became, since his very existence as a character was something of a late addition to the show's original planning. According to people who have researched the show's early development, an earlier earlier version of a pink starfish character was originally written for a different episode, planned as an angry bartender who was upset about being pink. That character eventually got reworked into the version of Patrick who appears throughout the rest of the series, living under his rock and serving as SpongeBob's closest friend, rather than as a one-time background figure with a grudge about his own coloring. The actor who ended up voicing him, Bill Fagerbach, auditioned for the role after the actor playing SpongeBob had already been cast, and by his own account, he did not immediately grasp what made the material special during the audition itself, only coming to appreciate the show's particular sense of humor and warmth once he had spent more time working on it. None of this changes how the character behaves on screen, but it is a useful reminder that Patrick, like most animated characters, went through some early reshaping before settling into the personality audiences would eventually come to know, which makes it less surprising that his very earliest appearances show a bit more variation than his later, more settled reputation would suggest. One of the clearest examples of that early variation comes from an episode simply called Boating School, which aired in August of 1999, making it one of the very first episodes the show ever produced. In this episode, SpongeBob has failed his driving exam at Mrs. Puff's boating school so many times that he has lost count, and he turns to Patrick for help, figuring out how to finally pass. Patrick comes up with a plan that involves hiding a small radio device inside SpongeBob's hat, with the antenna sticking out just enough to look like part of the hat's design, so that Patrick can talk SpongeBob through the entire driving test from a distance. The plan works remarkably well for most of the test. Patrick calmly and clearly walks SpongeBob through each part of the driving course, telling him exactly what to do at each turn, and SpongeBob ends up performing better than he ever has before, impressing Mrs. Puff along the way. The plan only falls apart near the very end, when Mrs. Puff jokes out loud that it looks like someone might be feeding SpongeBob the answers through a hidden radio, and SpongeBob panics upon realizing that this is exactly what has been happening, crashing the boat one more time as a result. This episode is worth paying attention to for two reasons. First, it shows Patrick coming up with a functional plan that actually works for almost the entire length of a difficult driving test, which requires a decent amount of focus and clear thinking, even if the plan itself was not exactly an honest one. Pulling off a scheme like this requires more than just a single clever idea. It requires Patrick to track where SpongeBob is on the course at every moment, communicate instructions clearly enough for SpongeBob to follow them in real time, and adjust what he is saying as the situation changes, all without being caught by Mrs. Puff until the very end. That is a meaningful amount of ongoing coordination for a character whose reputation rests so heavily on the idea that he cannot follow through on anything complicated. Second, it is worth being fully honest that people who study the show closely, including writers on fan reference sites, have pointed out that this kind of competence from Patrick stands out as unusual, even by the standards of the show's earliest episodes. In other words, this was not necessarily meant to establish Patrick as secretly brilliant on a regular basis. It was more likely just a fun idea for a single episode's plot, written before the show had fully settled into a consistent version of who Patrick was supposed to be. Being fair about this distinction matters, because the goal here is not to claim early Patrick was some kind of hidden genius, but to show that the show was clearly comfortable letting him succeed at something that required real coordination and clear communication, something that becomes much harder to imagine once his character narrows down further in later years. A similar kind of moment shows up again in a season 4 episode called Driven to Tears, which aired in February of 2007. In this episode, SpongeBob fails his boating exam yet again after Patrick's attempt to help him study backfires when Patrick accidentally eats the flashcards meant to help SpongeBob prepare. Annoyed on his friend's behalf and convinced that Mrs. Puff must be rigging the test against SpongeBob specifically, Patrick decides to take the exam himself just to prove that it is unfairly difficult. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Patrick passes the test with no trouble at all and earns his own driver's license, along with a brand new boatmobile after turning out to be a specific customer number that qualified him for a prize. For the rest of the episode, Patrick does end up acting fairly full of himself about this achievement, bragging about being a driving genius and ignoring basic traffic rules like stopping at red lights, which eventually leads to a chase with the police after SpongeBob, overcome with jealousy, tears up Patrick's license and gets both of them into serious trouble, ending with Patrick driving off a cliff directly into the parking lot of the local jail. That part of the episode, the bragging and the reckless attitude fits into a different part of Patrick's story that this video is going to look at more closely later, since it shows an early example of him being genuinely difficult to be around, rather than simply lovable and dim. What matters for this particular section, though, is the core detail sitting underneath all of that bragging. Whatever his attitude about it afterward, Patrick genuinely did pass a driving test that SpongeBob, a character usually treated as clearly more responsible and more capable in most situations, has failed dozens of times throughout the show. Passing a driving test requires a working understanding of how to safely operate a vehicle, which is a real skill, even if Patrick immediately showed that he did not understand or care about the rules that go along with holding a license. This creates an interesting and slightly odd contradiction sitting right at the center of his character during these years. He could be shown as fully capable of handling a specific practical task when the story called for it, while still being treated as the less intelligent one of the two friends overall. Beyond these two driving-related episodes, the general pattern of early Patrick shows up in smaller, quieter moments that are easy to miss unless someone is looking closely for them. During these years, Patrick is shown picking up on certain social situations that SpongeBob completely misses. One frequently mentioned example involves Squidward, who spends much of the show clearly annoyed by both SpongeBob and Patrick, often making his frustration obvious through his tone, his face, or outright complaining. SpongeBob, across a large number of these earlier episodes, seems to remain mostly unaware of just how irritated Squidward actually is, treating him as a friend and neighbor who enjoys spending time with them, even when Squidward is making it painfully clear that he does not. Patrick, on the other hand, has been shown across some of these same years actually noticing Squidward's frustration and understanding what it means, even if he does not always do anything helpful about it. Being able to read another person's mood accurately is a form of social awareness, and it is a different kind of intelligence than the kind measured by school tests or formal exams. Early Patrick appears to have at least some of this second kind of awareness, even while clearly lacking a lot of the first kind. Another small but telling example involves Sandy Cheeks, the squirrel who lives underwater inside an air-filled dome so she can survive without being a fish. In some of these earlier episodes, Patrick is described as being able to immediately understand that Sandy's underwater home would be dangerous for a sea creature to enter without protection, since it is filled with air instead of water. This might seem like a small or obvious detail, but it reflects a kind of basic, practical reasoning about cause and effect. Someone who truly could not think through even simple situations would likely not be able to draw that connection quickly, especially in a world where most creatures live underwater without ever needing to think about air being dangerous to them in the first place. It is worth balancing these examples out with a fair look at an episode where Patrick's limitations show up just as clearly, since the goal here is an honest picture rather than a one-sided one. In a Season 3 episode called New Student Starfish, Patrick decides to join SpongeBob at Mrs. Puff's boating school simply because he does not want to be left alone while his best friend is away during the day. When Mrs. Puff asks him for his name during roll call, a nervous Patrick answers with the number 24 instead of his actual name, and the two friends spend much of the class treating this mix-up as an ongoing joke between them. By the end of the episode, once SpongeBob and Patrick have gotten wrapped up in an unrelated classroom emergency involving a science project, Mrs. Puff asks what any of it had to do with boating school in the first place, and Patrick cheerfully admits that he had no idea he was even at boating school at all, having assumed the entire time that he had wandered into a different class altogether. This episode shows the other side of the balance being described in this section. Patrick can completely misunderstand where he is and why, even while sitting in the exact same classroom for an entire episode, which is a very different kind of moment than coaching a friend through a driving test using a hidden radio. Both of these things are true about the same character during these same early years, and neither one cancels the other one out. None of this is meant to argue that early Patrick was secretly a genius hiding behind a goofy exterior. That would overstate what the actual episodes show, and it would not match how the character behaves across the vast majority of these years. In most episodes from this period, Patrick is still shown struggling with basic facts, misunderstanding simple instructions, and generally being the less mentally sharp of the two best friends. The point here is narrower and more specific than that. Rather than being written as someone completely incapable of clear thought in any situation, early Patrick shows real range depending on what the story needs from him in a given moment. He can misunderstand something simple in one scene and then demonstrate genuine awareness or a working plan in the very next one. one. That range, moving between real limitation and real capability, depending on the situation, is part of what made him feel like a fuller character during these years, rather than a character built around a single, unchanging joke. There is one more example from these years worth mentioning, even though it works a little differently from the others, because it explores the idea of Patrick's intelligence directly, rather than showing it through small background moments. In an episode called Patrick's Smart Pants, an accident causes a piece of brain coral to become lodged in Patrick's head, and this sudden change actually turns him into a genius, with his head growing larger to match his newfound intelligence. Once this happens, Patrick starts noticing and correcting all sorts of problems around Bikini Bottom, fixing things that other characters had simply learned to live with, and looking down on SpongeBob and their usual way of spending time together as beneath him. His new intelligence also makes it harder for him to relate to the people he used to spend all his time with, since he can no longer connect with SpongeBob's simpler way of looking at the world, the way he once did without any trouble at all. Eventually, both SpongeBob and Squidward, who normally cannot agree on much of anything, find themselves agreeing that the old version of Patrick, less intelligent but easier to be around, was actually better company than this new and more capable version. This episode is a little different from the others described here, because the extra intelligence Patrick gains comes from an accident, rather than being presented as something quietly built into his personality the whole time. It does not prove that early Patrick was naturally smart underneath the surface. What it does show is that the show, during this stretch of its run, was comfortable exploring the idea of Patrick having real intelligence as an interesting premise worth building a full episode around, rather than treating the very idea of him being smart as something too far outside his character to even imagine. The fact that this episode exists at all says something about how flexible the writers still considered his personality to be during this period, since building a story around a character suddenly becoming brilliant works best when the audience can believe both versions, the usual one and the changed one, as reasonably connected to the same person. It is also worth noting that the episode ultimately treats his new intelligence as something to walk away from, rather than something to keep, which suggests the show itself was already treating his usual personality, limitations included, as the version worth protecting and returning to by the end of the story. Taken all together, these examples paint a picture of early Patrick that is more layered than his current reputation usually suggests. He was never presented as consistently sharp or reliably clever, and characters around him regularly treated him as the less capable one of the friend group. At the same time, he was shown succeeding at a real driving test on his own merit, coming up with a working plan that got his best friend through a difficult exam, picking up on social situations that his best friend completely missed, and reasoning correctly about basic dangers in his environment. He was also considered flexible enough as a character for an entire episode to explore what he might be like with real intelligence layered on top of who he already was, even while other episodes from these same years were perfectly happy to show him completely losing track of where he was and why. None of this makes him a secret genius. It does mean that his personality during these years had more moving parts than a single word like dumb can really capture, and that the character eventually reworked from an early, discarded idea about an angry pink bartender grew into someone whose earliest years carried a surprising amount of range before that range began to narrow in the seasons that followed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This matters for the comparison because a character's starting range shows how much room there was to lose. A character built around one trait cannot narrow much further, since there was little range to begin with. Patrick started out moving between real limitation and real capability, which leaves a lot more room for that range to shrink. Whether it actually shrank in one straight line, or moved forward, pulled back, then shifted again, turns out to be a more complicated story than it first appears. Section 5. Patrick's three-stage decline. Patrick's story does not move in one simple direction, the way it does for some other characters on this list. Instead of drifting steadily from clever to clueless in a straight line, his personality changed in noticeable stages, with each stage pushing him further from where he started, followed at one point by a partial step backward, before pushing forward again in a slightly different way. Untangling these stages one at a time makes it much easier to see exactly what happened to him, and why fans often describe his change as more complicated than the changes seen in other characters. The first shift happened fairly early, according to people people who study the show closely, starting near the end of the very first season. Before this point, Patrick's slower moments were balanced out by the kind of practical thinking and social awareness described in the last section. Things like coming up with a working plan to help SpongeBob pass a driving test, or noticing when Squidward was clearly annoyed. After this first shift, Patrick started leaning much harder into simple confusion and outright silliness, saying things that did not make logical sense at all, like wondering out loud whether mayonnaise counts as a musical instrument. Around this same period, the way Patrick was drawn on screen changed slightly too, with his eyebrows becoming thicker and more exaggerated, which visually matched the more exaggerated version of his personality that the writing was moving toward. This first change mostly affected how smart Patrick appeared to be. It did not yet make him unkind or difficult to be around. He was still a loyal, well-meaning friend to SpongeBob during this period. He had simply become noticeably less sharp than the version of him seen in the earliest handful of episodes. It is worth spending a little extra time on why this particular kind of change, one built mostly around simple non sequiturs and a slightly sillier design, feels so different from what happens to him later. A character saying something that does not make logical sense, like questioning whether a condiment could double as a musical instrument, is a fairly harmless kind of joke on its own. It does not hurt anyone, it does not put anyone in danger, and it does not damage any of his relationships with the people around him. This first stage essentially trimmed away some of the sharper, more capable moments described in the earlier section, without replacing them with anything darker. What was left behind was a gentler, goofier version of the same warm-hearted friend, someone whose thinking had gotten simpler without his heart changing at all. That distinction matters a great deal once the second stage is placed next to it, since the difference between losing sharpness and losing kindness turns out to be one of the most important dividing lines in Patrick's entire history. The second major shift happened later, and it changed something different about him. Rather than making him even less intelligent, this stage focused more on his personality and how he treated the people around him. During a stretch of seasons roughly covering the show's 6th through 9th years, Patrick starts showing up in episodes behaving in ways that go beyond simple obliviousness and start looking closer to genuine selfishness or cruelty. One clear example from this period comes from an episode called Pet Sitter Pat, which aired in September of 2011 during the show's 8th season. In this episode, Patrick agrees to look after SpongeBob's pet snail, Gary, while SpongeBob is away visiting his grandmother for her birthday. Rather than taking proper care of Gary, Patrick eats the snail food meant for him, leaves him hungry, and at one point decides that the best way to give Gary a bath is to use a flamethrower on him, an idea that goes about as badly as it sounds. Each time SpongeBob calls to check in, Patrick brushes off his concerns and insists everything is fine, even as the chaos at the house continues to grow behind him. By the time SpongeBob finally rushes home, his house has been flooded and partly destroyed, and Gary is shown clearly worse for wear from the entire experience. Another example from this same stretch shows Patrick agreeing to help SpongeBob prepare for an oral report he has to give at boating school, only for Patrick's version of helping to make the entire situation dramatically worse rather than better, without him ever seeming to notice or care that he was making things harder rather than easier. A third example shows Patrick acting deeply ungrateful towards SpongeBob after SpongeBob puts in a great deal of effort trying to give him an enjoyable staycation, treating his friend's generosity with irritation instead of appreciation. What makes this second stage stand out from the first one is the type of trait being exaggerated. The first stage took his lack of sharpness, something that was already part of his character from the start, and pushed it further. This second stage introduces something that feels less like an exaggeration of an old trait and more like a genuinely new and less likable side to him, one built around selfishness, carelessness toward his best friend's feelings, and in some cases, outright unkindness towards smaller and more defenseless characters like Gary. Fans and people who write detailed character breakdowns of the show have specifically pointed out that while Patrick had shown flashes of selfishness in earlier years too, these traits became a much larger and more constant part of his personality during this particular stretch of seasons, showing up far more often and in far more extreme forms than they had before. The Pet Sitter Pat example in particular is frequently singled out by people who have reviewed the show closely as one of the clearest instances of this shift, since the episode places Patrick in a position of direct responsibility over a defenseless character, and then shows him failing that responsibility in an escalating and increasingly careless way, rather than through one single brief mistake. Some somewhere near the end of this stretch, according to people who track the show's history closely, something interesting happens. Following a Season 9 episode where Squidward is shown reading SpongeBob's private diary out loud in front of the entire restaurant, humiliating him in the process, fans have noted that Patrick's overall jerkiness in later episodes was noticeably toned down compared to how he had been written just before. This does not mean Patrick suddenly became perfect or returned all the way back to his earliest personality. In fact, within this very same diary reading episode, Patrick is shown joining in with the crowd of people, laughing at SpongeBob's embarrassment, and later criticizing Squidward for blaming everyone else for what happened, despite having taken part in the same behavior himself. So even the episode that fans point to as the turning point still shows him behaving in a fairly unflattering way. What changed afterward, according to people who have compared these episodes closely, is more about frequency and intensity going forward, rather than any single dramatic moment of him becoming kind again. The extreme selfishness that had defined Stage 2 simply started showing up less often and with less edge in the episodes that followed. This partial pullback did not last as the final word on his character, though. According to people who have traced his history across the show's full run, a third and separate shift became visible in the seasons that followed, continuing to show up well into the show's more recent history. And this third shift moved him even further away from where he had started in terms of pure awareness than either of the first two stages had. This time, the change pushed hardest on his intelligence again, similar to the first stage, but taken to a much greater extreme. During this later stretch, Patrick becomes associated with constant, almost non-stop displays of confusion and poor judgment, often centered around eating things that are clearly not meant to be food. One frequently cited example comes from an episode called Walhalla, which aired in January of 2023 as part of the show's 13th season. In this episode, while SpongeBob is dealing with a strange man who has secretly been living inside his walls for years, Patrick wanders into the house, opens the refrigerator, and finds a small pile of waste left behind by sea urchins living in a garden hidden inside the wall space. Mistaking this waste for raisins, Patrick eats a handful of it without a second thought, and later throws more of it at a television screen simply because he is bored with what is playing. This kind of moment, treating something clearly unappetizing and out of place as an ordinary snack without pausing to question it, fits the broader pattern that people who track the show describe for this later stretch of Patrick's history, where his judgment about even the most basic everyday situations becomes far less reliable than it was during either of the two earlier stages already described. Across this stretch of the show, Patrick is also frequently described as behaving in ways that put other characters in real danger simply because he does not seem to grasp cause and effect at even a basic level, rather than because he is being deliberately unkind the way he sometimes was during the earlier jerk-focus stage. Looking at all three of these stages side by side gives a much clearer picture of how complicated Patrick's overall journey actually is, compared to a character whose change moves in one steady direction. The first stage took away some of his sharper, more capable moments and replaced them with simple, harmless confusion. The second stage introduced a colder, more selfish personality that had very little to do with intelligence at all, and instead focused on how he treated the people closest to him, most clearly on display in an episode where a defenseless pet was left in his care and came out the worse for it. The partial pullback afterward eased off some of that colder edge without fully restoring the balance seen in the earliest seasons. The third stage then pushed his lack of awareness to an extreme point that goes well beyond the innocent confusion of the first stage, creating a version of him still visible in episodes airing more than 2 decades after the show began that many fans consider almost unrecognizable compared to where the character began. This layered path matters a great deal for the larger comparison this video is building, because it shows that flanderization does not always look like a single steady slide in one direction. Sometimes a character's defining traits shift more than once, changing which specific part of their personality gets exaggerated at different points across a show's history. Patrick's love of money never became an issue the way it did for another character in this comparison, and his selfishness never became his single defining feature the way greed eventually did for someone else. Instead, different pieces of his original personality got pulled apart and pushed to different extremes at different times, which makes it harder to sum up his overall change with one simple before and after comparison. It also makes his case case a useful example of just how differently this same general pattern can play out from character to character, even within the exact same show, since the same underlying process that hardened one character into a single dominant trait instead scattered across several different traits in his case, touching his intelligence twice and his basic kindness once, in 3 separate movements spread across more than a decade of the show's history. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With Patrick's more complicated path now laid out clearly, the comparison moves next to a character whose change looks almost nothing like his. Rather than shifting through several distinct stages built around different traits, the next character's story is defined less by a change in personality and more by a narrowing of purpose, where the range of situations he gets written into shrinks down into a much smaller set of repeating patterns that fans have noticed again and again across the later years of the show. Section 6. Squidward and the Everyone Torments Him formula. Squidward Tentacles is SpongeBob and Patrick's next-door neighbor, and he also works alongside SpongeBob at the Krusty Krab, running the cash register while SpongeBob handles the grill. He lives in a home shaped like an Easter Island statue, sitting right between SpongeBob's pineapple and Patrick's rock, which means he almost never gets a break from the two of them. Outside of work, Squidward considers himself an artist, a painter, and most of all, a clarinet player, even though the show has made it clear from very early on that his musical skills are not particularly good. His deepest wish across the entire series has always been simple. He wants peace, quiet, and a little bit of recognition for his talents, and he almost never gets any of the 3. Looking closely at Squidward's story across the show's history reveals something a little different from what happened to the other characters covered so far in this comparison. His own personality did not narrow down around one single trait the way it did for the crab who runs the Krusty Krab. His overall temperament also did not swing through several distinct stages the way it did for his starfish neighbor. In fact, several people who have written detailed breakdowns of the show over the years have specifically pointed out that Squidward's own personality held up better across the seasons than most of the other main characters, changing less dramatically than nearly everyone else on this list. What actually shifted around Squidward was something a little more specific. It was not so much who he was as a person, but the kind of situations the show kept placing him into, and how deserved his suffering in those situations felt from one era of the show to the next. In the earliest seasons, Squidward is introduced as someone who could fairly be described as an entertaining jerk. He is short-tempered, easily annoyed, and often actively unkind to SpongeBob without much provocation. In one of the earliest episodes, Squidward deliberately plays a cruel trick on both SpongeBob and Patrick, making each of them believe the other no longer wants to be his friend, purely so he can enjoy some peace and quiet without either of them bothering him. In another early episode, he goes out of his way to pull off an elaborate and mean-spirited prank on SpongeBob to celebrate April Fool's Day, purely for his own amusement. These moments establish him early on as someone with a genuinely mean streak, not just someone who happens to be grumpy because his neighbors are exhausting to be around. Because of this, when bad things happen to Squidward in these earliest seasons, whether through his own bad luck or through some kind of backfire from his own scheming, audiences could generally feel like he had it coming to some degree. He was often the one starting trouble, so watching him end up on the receiving end of consequences felt like a fair trade within the logic of the show. As the series moved past its earliest years and into the seasons following the first movie, the situations built around Squidward started to shift in a noticeable way. Rather than mostly getting into trouble because of his own scheming or his own short temper, Squidward increasingly finds himself on the receiving end of harm that has very little to do with anything he actually did wrong. 2 episodes that people who study the show closely point to often are ones where SpongeBob, without any real understanding of how much damage he is causing, forces Squidward through genuinely painful or humiliating experiences, and then reacts with laughter or excitement instead of concern. In one of these episodes, SpongeBob drags Squidward onto an unwanted and clearly terrifying flight, and later laughs about how badly it went, seemingly without registering that Squidward was actually suffering rather than simply being dramatic. In another, SpongeBob accidentally causes serious injury to Squidward, and then makes his condition significantly worse through sheer carelessness, again without any real sense that what he is doing is harmful rather than playful. This shift matters a great deal for understanding what actually changed around Squidward. Squidward, because it moves the entire relationship out of the realm of fair comedic payback and into something closer to one-sided harm. In the earliest seasons, Squidward's bad luck often followed his own bad behavior, which made the humor feel balanced. In the later seasons, following the same basic setup of SpongeBob and Patrick causing trouble and Squidward suffering the consequences, the balance tips heavily towards Squidward simply being an innocent target rather than someone paying for his own actions. He did not necessarily do anything wrong in these later episodes to deserve what happens to him. He is simply there, minding his own business, when the chaos created by his neighbors crashes into his life anyway. At the same time that this shift in fairness was happening, a second pattern developed alongside it, one that has less to do with how deserved Squidward's suffering felt, and more to do with how repetitive the situations built around him became. A number of longtime viewers who have reviewed and discussed specific stretches of the show's later seasons have pointed out that a large portion of newer episodes tend to fall into a small handful of repeating setups. One of the most frequently mentioned of these setups involves SpongeBob, sometimes joined by Patrick, tormenting Squidward, often without any of the earlier seasons' balance, where Squidward's own short temper or scheming played a role in starting the trouble. Where earlier seasons gave Squidward a wider range of storylines, ones built around his art, his music, his social ambitions, or his rivalry with a wealthy former classmate named Squilliam Fancyson. Later seasons increasingly returned to this narrower well of SpongeBob and Patrick simply making his life difficult, often for reasons that boil down to little more than them wanting his attention or unintentionally destroying something he cares about. This narrowing shows up clearly if the show's overall pattern of episodes is looked at as a whole rather than one episode at a time. A single episode built around Squidward suffering through his neighbor's antics is not unusual for any era of the show, since that basic setup has always been part of its comedic foundation. What becomes noticeable only when looking across many episodes at once is how often that specific setup gets reused in the later seasons, compared to how often Squidward's other interests and storylines get real attention. His passion for art and music, which was a consistent and fairly stable part of his character across the entire run of the show, started sharing much less screen time with itself and much more screen time with this one repeating formula of him being an unwilling victim of his neighbor's behavior. There is an interesting side effect that came from this particular kind of change, one that actually sets Squidward apart from every other character looked at so far in this comparison. Rather than making him less likable over time, this shift in the fairness and repetition of his suffering ended up making a lot of fans feel more sympathy for him, not less. Several people who track how fan opinion on the show's characters has shifted over the years have specifically noted that Squidward's reputation actually improved across the seasons, moving from being seen mainly as a snobbish jerk in the earliest years to being seen by many older viewers as one of the more relatable characters on the entire show. Part of the reason given for this shift is that many adult viewers, watching the show either as parents or as former kids who grew up with it, find it easier to relate to someone dealing with an exhausting job, invasive neighbors, and unappreciated creative passions than to relate to the endless enthusiasm of someone like SpongeBob. As SpongeBob and Patrick's own behavior grew more careless and destructive in these later seasons, Squidward's frustration with them started to look less like unreasonable grouchiness and more like a fair reaction to genuinely being mistreated. This creates an unusual position for Squidward within the larger question this video is asking. His own personal traits, his short temper, his artistic ambitions, his general dislike of being bothered, remained fairly consistent across the entire show, rather than being pushed to some new extreme, the way Mr. Krabs' greed or Patrick's selfishness eventually were. What changed around him instead was the shape of the stories the show chose to keep telling about him, narrowing down over time into a smaller set of situations built around watching him suffer, while at the same time removing much of the earlier justification for that suffering. In a strange way, this means Squidward drifted the least out of the characters looked at in this comparison, in terms of who he actually is as a person, even while the world of the show around him narrowed in a way that changed how audiences experienced watching him. It is worth being fair and mentioning that even within this pattern, the show has continued to give Squidward moments that go beyond this narrower formula, especially once the seasons following his most heavily criticized stretch arrived. He still gets episodes centered on his art, his music, his rivalry with Squilliam, and occasional moments where his genuine talent shines through, despite years of being written as mostly untalented. His personality was never boiled down into a single joke, the way some other characters on this list eventually were. The change here is more subtle, showing up in the balance of episode types across many years, rather than in any single defining moment where his whole character seemed to shift overnight. This makes Squidward a useful comparison point for understanding just how differently this overall pattern of change can affect different members of the same cast. Some characters lose range because one part of their personality grows so large it crowds out everything else. Squidward's case shows a different kind of change entirely, one where the character himself mostly holds steady, while the stories built around him lean harder and harder on one repeating formula, shifting the balance of fairness in that formula along the way. Whether this counts as a smaller kind of change compared to what happened to Mr. Krabs or Patrick, or simply a different kind of change working through a different mechanism, is worth keeping in mind heading into the final verdict at the end of this video. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next character in this comparison presents yet another version of this same overall pattern, and this one runs in a direction that is almost the complete opposite of everything covered so far. Rather than becoming meaner, dumber, or more repetitive in his own role, this next character actually became easier to root for over time, shifting from a competent and genuinely threatening rival into something closer to an underdog that a surprising number of fans ended up quietly cheering for instead of against. Section 7. Plankton's Reversal. Plankton, whose full name is Sheldon J. Plankton, owns the Chum Bucket, a small and consistently unsuccessful restaurant sitting directly across the street from the Krusty Krab. For nearly the entire run of the show, his main goal has been stealing the secret formula for Krabby Patties from his rival, Mr. Krabs, so that his own restaurant can finally compete. Behind the scenes, Plankton was not originally planned to become a long-running character at all. He first showed up in an episode simply titled Plankton, meant as a one-time appearance, and the show's creator was reportedly unsure at first what to do with him going forward. A writer on the show who liked the character pushed to keep developing him, and that decision eventually turned Plankton into one of the most consistent presences across the entire series. What makes Plankton's story worth its own close look in this comparison is that his overall change across the years runs in nearly the opposite direction from Mr. Krabs. Where Mr. Krabs started out as a flawed but balanced character and slowly hardened into something closer to a cartoon villain, Plankton started out as a genuinely dangerous and competent villain and slowly softened into a character that a large number of fans grew to feel sorry for rather than afraid of. Looking closely at how and when this shift happened helps explain why so many longtime viewers eventually found themselves rooting for the character the show originally introduced as its resident bad guy. The clearest and most extreme example of early, competent Plankton comes from the first SpongeBob movie, which came out in 2004. In this film, Plankton succeeds at something he almost never manages to pull off across the rest of the series. He actually gets his hands on the secret formula, uses it to take over the entire town of Bikini Bottom, places its citizens under his control, and even manages to bring King Neptune himself under his influence at one point in the story. During the course of the film, he also comes close to causing serious harm to Mr. Krabs. This version of Plankton is genuinely threatening in a way that goes far beyond his usual small-scale scheming seen in most individual episodes. He is shown as intelligent, resourceful, and capable of actually winning, at least for a while, which is something that rarely happens for him in the show's regular episodes, either before or after this point. Following the release of this movie, a noticeable change starts showing up in how Plankton gets written across the show's regular episodes. Rather than being consistently dangerous, he increasingly becomes a character whose plans fail constantly, whose confidence outpaces his actual ability, and whose attempts to seem intimidating often come across as more sad than scary. People who study the show's history describe this as a period of what amounts to a decline in how effective and threatening he is allowed to be, with many individual episodes treating him as pitiable rather than genuinely dangerous. This does not mean every single appearance during this stretch shows him failing completely. He still schemes, still builds inventions, and still occasionally comes close to success. What changes is the overall tone surrounding those attempts, which shifts away from real menace and towards something closer to comedy, built around watching a small, overconfident character fail again and again. A big part of why this particular shift shift landed so strongly with audiences has to do with timing. This softer, more pitiable version of Plankton became especially noticeable during roughly the same stretch of seasons 6 through 10, when Mr. Krabs was becoming harsher, more selfish, and less willing to face fair consequences for his actions, as covered earlier in this video. Because both of these shifts were happening at the same time, within the same ongoing rivalry, the emotional balance of that rivalry flipped almost entirely. In the earliest seasons, watching Plankton fail to steal the formula from an honest, hard-working business owner felt like watching a scheming troublemaker get what he deserved. During this later stretch, watching Plankton fail against a business owner who was now regularly shown exploiting his own employees and treating customers with open disregard started to feel more like watching an underdog lose to someone who did not deserve to win either. This shift gets even more noticeable once a specific piece of Plankton's backstory gets factored in. An episode focused on the origins of his rivalry with Mr. Krabs reveals that the two of them actually knew each other long before either restaurant existed, and that Plankton's resentment toward Mr. Krabs grew out of watching his own cooking attempts fail, while Mr. Krabs became a successful business owner. This origin story gives Plankton's motivation a grounded, almost relatable shape. He is not portrayed as evil for the sake of being evil. He is portrayed as someone who has spent years watching a former acquaintance succeed at exactly the thing he could never manage to do himself, and who has let that frustration curdle into an obsession with getting even. Combined with his increasingly frequent failures during the later seasons, this backstory made it easier for viewers to see him as a small, insecure character lashing out at a world that never gave him a fair shot, rather than as a genuine threat that needed to be stopped. One consistent detail about Plankton that stayed remarkably stable across the entire run of the show, even while his overall menace rose and fell, is his relationship with Karen, a computer program who serves as both his only employee and his romantic partner. Across nearly every era of the show, Plankton is shown treating Karen with real affection and respect, relying on her for advice, defending her when others insult her, and generally treating their relationship as something genuine, rather than a source of comedy at her expense. This part of his character did not get exaggerated or flattened the way his overall menace level did. It remained a steady, grounding piece of who he is, and it is often cited by fans as one of the clearest reasons his personality never fully collapsed into a single joke, the way some other characters on this list eventually did. Even during his most pitiful or most cartoonishly evil stretches, his genuine care for Karen tends to stay present in the background. It would not be accurate to describe Plankton's overall path as a single, steady decline in menace, from the 2004 movie all the way through to today, since his story does not move in quite that straight a line. Several specific episodes from later in the show's run, particularly around the show's 7th season, are pointed to by fans as moments where he returned to being a genuinely clever and threatening villain again, at least temporarily. In one of these episodes, he organizes an entire fake race through town purely as a distraction, allowing a disguised robot double of himself to slip past everyone and attempt to steal the formula while the whole town is looking the other way. A plan clever enough that it takes nearly the entire main cast working together to stop it. In another, he manages to build an entire elevated roadway that redirects traffic and business directly toward the chum bucket while damaging the natural jellyfish fields the town depends on, giving him a genuine, if temporary, victory over Mr. Krabs. These episodes show that the show never fully lost the ability to write a sharp, competent version of Plankton when the story called for it. They exist as exceptions within a much larger overall pattern, rather than being the general rule for how he is written across most individual episodes. Looking at the show's more recent seasons, some fans, and people who track character changes closely, have described yet another shift in how Plankton gets used, one that moves in a slightly different direction from either his early menace or his later sympathetic failures. During some of the show's more recent seasons, several critics have pointed out that his motivations behind individual episodes have become harder to predict or take seriously, with him sometimes appearing as a fully committed, almost cartoonishly evil villain, and other times appearing as someone who spends most of an episode simply complaining about how unfair his life has been, depending on whatever a specific episode's plot happens to need from him. This inconsistency suggests that even after everything else that happened to his character across the years, his overall shape has continued shifting, rather than settling into one permanent version, which mirrors the kind of layered, non-linear change change already seen in Patrick's story earlier in this video. Taken as a whole, Plankton's journey across the show stands out from every other character examined so far, because it moves in the opposite direction from the general pattern most people associate with this topic. Rather than becoming meaner or more exaggerated in a way that makes him less likable, he became less threatening in a way that made a large number of fans like him more, at least during the specific stretch of seasons when his softer, more pitiable portrayal overlapped with Mr. Krabs' harshest years. His genuine care for Karen remained a stable anchor throughout nearly every version of his character, keeping him from ever fully collapsing into a single joke. And his story did not move in one simple direction anyway, since flashes of real competence kept reappearing here and there, even during his most sympathetic stretches, followed by newer inconsistencies in more recent seasons that complicate the picture even further. This reversal, a character originally built to be feared, ending up as a character many fans quietly root for, raises an interesting question worth carrying into the rest of this comparison. Change does not always make a character worse in the eyes of an audience, even when it moves a character further away from where they originally started. Plankton drifted just as far from his original design as some of the other characters covered so far, but the direction of that drift left him in a very different place in how fans feel about him. Whether that makes his case count as more change, less change, or simply a different flavor of the same overall pattern depends a great deal on how the comparison ends up weighing direction alongside distance, which is a question worth returning to once every character on this list has had a fair turn. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one character left in the main cast whose journey has not been discussed yet, and this one carries a slightly heavier question than any of the others, since he happens to be the character the entire show is named after. If nearly everyone standing around him drifted this far from where they started, it raises the obvious next question of whether he managed to stay exactly the same person he was back in 1999, or whether his own ambition and drive quietly slipped away somewhere along the way, without most viewers even noticing it happening. Section 8. SpongeBob himself isn't exempt. SpongeBob SquarePants is, obviously, the character the entire show is built around, and for a lot of casual viewers, it can be easy to assume that the character everyone else changed around must have stayed exactly the same. His creator, Steven Hillenburg, actually based him on an earlier character called Bob the Sponge, originally created for an educational book Hillenburg wrote back in the late 1980s about ocean life along coastlines. By the time the show launched in 1999, that character had grown into the cheerful, energetic fry cook who lives in a pineapple, works at the Krusty Krab, and dreams of finally passing his boating exam. Looking closely at how this character has been written across more than 2 decades reveals that even the person the whole show is named after did not escape the same general pattern affecting nearly everyone else in his circle of friends. In the earliest seasons, SpongeBob is written with a specific and somewhat surprising kind of intelligence, sitting underneath his usual excitement and childlike energy. This shows up clearly in the very first season, in the episode focused on his boating exam. Even though the entire plot revolves around him repeatedly failing his driving test, the episode makes a point of showing that he already knows the written portion of the exam by heart, having taken it so many times that he can answer every question instantly and correctly. His actual problem in this early episode is not a lack of knowledge or understanding. It is nervousness. He panics the moment the driving portion of the test begins, and that panic, not ignorance, is what causes him to fail again and again. This is a meaningfully different kind of character than one who simply does not understand how driving works at all, and it shows that the earliest version of SpongeBob combined real knowledge with an emotional weakness, rather than being built entirely around a lack of intelligence. Alongside this, early SpongeBob is also written with clear personal ambition, something that goes beyond simply wanting to have fun every day. Multiple early episodes focus on how much he cares about being recognized as an excellent fry cook, and how deeply it bothers him when someone else threatens to take away that recognition. In one storyline, he becomes visibly upset and jealous when a former Krusty Krab employee is remembered as having been just as good at the job as he is. In another, he becomes distressed when a coworker starts winning the restaurant's Employee of the Month award instead of him, treating the loss of that title as a real blow to his sense of identity rather than something to shrug off. These moments show a character who takes real pride in his skills and genuinely wants to be seen as excellent at what he does, not just someone who happens to enjoy his job because he is too simple simple-minded to want anything more out of life. As the show moved into the years following the release of the first movie, particularly from around the middle of the fourth season onward, and becoming especially noticeable by the sixth season, a lot of people who study the show closely describe SpongeBob shifting away from this combination of real knowledge, real ambition, and occasional nervousness, and moving instead toward a much simpler and more consistently naive version of himself. Descriptions of this shift often point out that the earliest version of the character combined genuine intelligence with childlike innocence, while the later version increasingly drops the intelligence and keeps mostly the innocence, sometimes described as him becoming barely more capable of clear thinking than the least sharp version of Patrick from the earliest seasons, where his failures used to come from something specific, like nervousness during a test he had actually studied for. His failures in these later years increasingly come from a much more general and much less specific kind of cluelessness, one that applies to almost every situation he finds himself in, rather than being tied to one particular weakness. This shift also affected how SpongeBob's relationship with Squidward gets written, and this particular change carries more weight than a simple loss of sharpness, because it touches on how much responsibility he seems to take for the harm his actions cause. In the earliest seasons, SpongeBob's constant intrusions into Squidward's life come across as the well-meaning overenthusiasm of someone who simply does not realize his neighbor wants to be left alone. As the show moves into its later seasons, a number of specific episodes show him going much further than simple overenthusiasm, actively causing real physical harm or serious inconvenience to Squidward, and then reacting with laughter or excitement rather than concern once he sees the damage he has caused. One frequently cited example involves him forcing Squidward onto a flight Squidward clearly does not want to take, then laughing about how badly the experience went once it is over, seemingly without registering that Squidward genuinely suffered through it, rather than simply being overly dramatic about a minor inconvenience. Another shows him worsening an injury Squidward is already dealing with through sheer carelessness, again without much sign that he understands or cares about the seriousness of what he has done. This kind of behavior moves past simple childlike obliviousness and edges closer to a character who causes real harm without processing the consequences at all, which is a noticeably different problem than just being less clever than he used to be. Alongside this shift in his intelligence and his awareness of how his actions affect others, several people who have written about the show closely have also pointed out a change in how much personal ambition SpongeBob is shown having beyond his day-to-day happiness. In the earliest seasons, as already described, he cares deeply about excelling at his job and being recognized for it. In later seasons, this drive is often described as fading into simple contentment with things staying exactly the way they already are. He becomes comfortable being a fry cook indefinitely, with little interest in advancement, and in several episodes he is shown temporarily covering more demanding jobs, like running the register or even managing the restaurant, only to return to his usual fry cook position afterward, without any lingering desire to hold on to the more important role. This version of him treats his current situation as fully satisfying, rather than as one step on the way towards something bigger, which stands in contrast to the more driven, more competitive version of him seen in those earlier episodes, built around his jealousy over titles like Employee of the Month. It is important to be fair to SpongeBob's overall story, and point out that, much like both Patrick and Plankton described earlier in this video, his change does not move in one single unbroken line from his original self toward this simpler, more careless version. People who have tracked the show closely across its full run have noted specific later stretches, including parts of the 8th season and a number of episodes from the 12th season onward, where his writing shifts back towards something closer to his earlier balance of enthusiasm, competence, and genuine warmth. This means his story fits the same general pattern already seen with Patrick and Plankton, where a character's personality does not simply collapse in one direction forever, but instead moves through different stretches that lean harder into certain traits before easing back again, sometimes more than once across the show's long history. One part of SpongeBob's character that has remained genuinely consistent across nearly every stretch of the show, regardless of how his personality shifted elsewhere, is his actual skill at his job. Across every era of the show, from the very first season all the way through its most recent episodes, he is reliably shown as an excellent fry cook, someone whose cooking ability is rarely questioned, even during stretches where nearly everything else about his personality was being pushed to some some kind of extreme. This stability matters for understanding the full shape of his character, because it shows that not every part of him got pulled into the larger pattern of exaggeration affecting the show's cast. His core identity as someone who is genuinely good at the one thing he does every day stayed intact, even while his intelligence, his ambition beyond that job, and his awareness of how his actions affect the people around him all shifted more noticeably at different points across the years. Putting this all together, SpongeBob's story shows that even the character the entire show revolves around was not fully protected from the same general forces that reshaped nearly everyone standing around him. His early combination of real knowledge, genuine ambition, and occasional emotional weakness gradually gave way, especially during the stretch of seasons following the first movie, to a simpler and more consistently naive version of himself, one whose obliviousness, at times, crossed into actually causing real harm to the people closest to him, without much sign of understanding or caring about it. At the same time, his story never fully hardened into one single unchanging shape, with several later stretches showing signs of the writing pulling back toward his earlier balance, and his core skill as a fry cook remaining a steady, unshaken part of who he is across every single version of the character the show has ever produced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. If even the character the show is named after shows this same pattern, it is hard to argue anyone in the main cast came through untouched. Each character changed in their own direction and by their own path. What is left is weighing those paths against each other to see who ended up furthest from where they started. Section 9, the fan consensus snapshot. Every single character looked at so far in this comparison has been examined mostly through specific episodes, specific plot details, and specific behind-the-scenes facts about the show's history. That approach works well for building an honest picture of how each character changed, but it leaves out a bigger question worth asking before moving into a final verdict. Is the idea that this cast changed dramatically over the years actually a widely shared belief among the people who watched the show closely? Or is it mostly a smaller, louder group of critics whose opinions do not represent how most fans actually feel? Answering that question requires stepping back from individual characters for a moment and looking at some of the broader, more measurable signs of how audiences have responded to the show across its entire run. One of the clearest places to look for this kind of broader evidence is audience rating data collected on review aggregator websites, which track how large numbers of regular viewers rate individual seasons of a show after watching them. Looking at how SpongeBob's own audience scores have moved across different seasons paints a picture that lines up closely with everything already described about individual characters in the earlier sections of this video. The show's very first season carries an audience approval score of 98% on one of the most widely used platforms for this kind of tracking, reflecting how positively viewers responded to those earliest episodes overall. By the time the show reaches its 6th season, that same kind of audience approval score drops all the way down to 60%. Season 8 lands even a little lower than that, at 56%. Then, by the time the show reaches its 9th season, that audience score climbs back up to 72%, showing a real recovery compared to the lowest point, even if it never fully returns to where the show started. These numbers matter for this comparison because they are not opinions pulled from a single blog post or a single fan wiki with its own particular slant. They come from large numbers of individual viewers rating each season independently, which makes them a useful outside check on everything described character by character earlier in this video. The dip in audience approval lines up almost exactly with the stretch of seasons already identified as the harshest turning point for several characters covered here, including the seasons where Mr. Krabs became noticeably crueler without facing fair consequences, where Patrick's personality swung hardest into open selfishness, and where SpongeBob himself was described by several sources as losing much of his earlier balance between intelligence and innocence. The fact that a completely separate measurement, based purely on how satisfied ordinary viewers felt after watching each season, drops during this exact same window adds real weight to the idea that these individual character observations were not simply the opinions of a small, unusually critical group of fans. A large number of regular viewers were apparently noticing and reacting to something similar happening across these same years, even if they were not necessarily thinking about it in terms of any single character's personality shifting. The partial recovery shown in these same numbers, with the audience score climbing back up by the 9th season also lines up with something already noted separately for several individual characters earlier in this video. Patrick's harshest, jerk-driven stage was described as easing off somewhat following a specific Season 9 episode. SpongeBob's own writing was described by multiple sources as showing signs of returning to a more balanced version of himself in stretches following this same general period. None of these separate observations were made by comparing them directly to this audience rating data, yet they land on a remarkably similar timeline. When several independent sources, built around completely different kinds of evidence, keep landing on the same rough stretch of seasons as either the low point or the turning point for the show, it becomes much harder to dismiss the overall pattern as coincidence or exaggeration. Beyond simple audience ratings, another sign of just how widespread this general belief has become among fans comes from looking at the sheer number of large, detailed, fan-created reference projects built specifically around cataloging and discussing this exact topic. Several extensive fan wikis exist purely to document episodes many viewers consider poorly written, along with detailed breakdowns of which characters were affected and how. Some of these projects specifically focus on identifying and explaining what they call the worst examples of characters being written inconsistently or unfairly across different stretches of the show's history, going episode by episode and even scene by scene in some cases. Others focus more broadly on ranking and reviewing entire seasons against each other, again using this same general framework of the show's writing and characters shifting noticeably compared to where they started. The scale and detail of these projects says something important on its own. A small handful of overly critical fans complaining occasionally would not be enough to sustain the kind of large, carefully organized reference material that multiple separate fan communities have put together and maintained over many years. Projects of this size and detail generally only get built and kept updated when a large enough group of people actually cares enough about the underlying topic to keep contributing to it. Fans have also developed their own informal ways of dividing the show's history into distinct chunks of time, giving each stretch its own nickname based on how that group of fans remembers the overall quality and tone of the writing during that period. One breakdown, created by a community of longtime viewers, divides the show into several named stretches, starting with an early period covering the first season and part of the second, followed by what these fans call a golden stretch, running through the middle of the second season into the early part of the fourth, followed by a period these same fans describe as a noticeable decline, covering the middle of the fourth season through the fifth, followed by a stretch they specifically label as the fall of the show, covering the sixth and seventh seasons, followed by what they call a period after that fall, covering roughly the eighth season and part of the ninth, and finally, a newer, more mixed stretch, running from partway through the ninth season onward. It is worth being clear that this specific breakdown reflects the opinion of one particular group of fans, rather than some kind of official or universally agreed upon timeline, and other fans dividing up the same show's history might draw the lines in slightly different places, or use different names for each stretch. What matters here is not the exact wording of these labels, but the fact that so many different fans, working independently of each other, keep landing on a remarkably similar overall shape when they try to map out the show's history in their own words. An early, strong stretch, followed by a noticeable decline, followed by some kind of partial recovery, shows up again and again across many different attempts to describe the show's journey. Even when the people making these descriptions never coordinated with each other or borrowed directly from one another's work. It is just as important, in the interest of giving a fair and complete picture, to be honest about where this fan consensus is not actually as unified as it might first appear. Not every fan agrees on exactly which seasons count as the worst, or exactly how much blame belongs to any single season compared to its neighbors. Some fan discussions place most of the blame specifically on the 6th and 7th seasons, while treating the 8th season as a mixed bag that partially recovers some of the show's earlier charm. Other fans push back on this timeline entirely, arguing that certain stretches labeled as declines by some viewers still contain plenty of genuinely well-loved episodes, and that judging an entire season based on its worst moments unfairly ignores its better ones. There is also real disagreement over how complete the show's later recovery actually was, with some fans arguing that seasons from the 12th onward largely return to the spirit spirit of the earliest years, while others argue that the show never fully recaptured what made those earliest seasons special, even during its stronger later stretches. None of this disagreement is unusual for a show that has run for more than 2 decades and produced hundreds of episodes, since audiences naturally form different personal opinions about such a large body of work. What is worth noting, though, is that this disagreement tends to happen around the details and the exact boundaries, not around the basic underlying idea that the show's tone and character writing shifted meaningfully somewhere along the way. There is also a difference worth pointing out between fan agreement on the general existence of this pattern and fan agreement on which specific character changed the most because of it. Nearly every source gathered across this entire video, whether built around Mr. Krabs, Patrick, Squidward, Plankton, or SpongeBob himself, describes some version of the same underlying idea, that a defining trait or a defining role got pushed further than it originally sat, whether that push made a character meaner, dumber, more repetitive, more sympathetic, or some combination of several of these at once. Where these same sources start to disagree with each other is in ranking these different characters against one another. Some writers focused heavily on this topic clearly consider Mr. Krabs the clearest and most extreme example, pointing to the sheer scale of his shift from a flawed but balanced boss into something closer to a cartoon villain who regularly avoided consequences. Others focused just as heavily on Patrick, pointing to how his personality moved through multiple distinct stages rather than shifting just once, which some fans consider an even more dramatic kind of change than a single steady slide in one direction. Still others bring up Squidward's shifting narrative role, or Plankton's complete reversal from menace to underdog as the more interesting or more significant case, depending on what kind of change they personally consider more meaningful to track. This lack of full agreement on a single winner is actually useful information in its own right, rather than a problem for this comparison to work around. It confirms that the question this whole video is built around does not have one single obvious answer sitting out in plain sight, waiting to be repeated by everyone who has ever thought about this topic. If the answer were obvious, there would be far less discussion, far fewer detailed breakdowns, and far fewer competing rankings scattered across different fan communities. Instead, the fact that so many different, carefully reasoned arguments exist for several different characters shows that this question genuinely depends on how someone chooses to measure change in the first place. Someone who values total contrast between where a character started and where they ended up might lean toward Mr. Krabs. Someone who values how many separate directions a character's personality moved through might lean toward Patrick. Someone who values how completely a character's role within the story flipped from one side of a relationship to the other might lean toward Plankton. Each of these ways of measuring change is reasonable on its own terms, and each one can lead to a different final answer depending on which standard gets applied most heavily. Bringing together everything gathered across this section, a clear overall shape emerges even without a single, universally agreed upon answer to the exact ranking question. Independent audience rating numbers show a real and measurable dip in viewer satisfaction, landing on almost the exact same stretch of seasons already identified through individual character analysis earlier in this video, followed by a real and measurable partial recovery afterward. Large, detailed fan reference projects exist specifically because enough people care about tracking and discussing this exact pattern in careful detail, which would not happen if the underlying belief were limited to only a small, unusually critical slice of the audience. Multiple independent attempts by different fan communities to map out the show's history in their own words keep landing on a similar overall shape, even without directly copying from each other. At the same time, real and honest disagreement continues over the finer details, including exactly which seasons deserve the most blame, how complete the later recovery actually was, and which specific character ultimately drifted the furthest from where they began. This combination of strong agreement on the basic pattern alongside real disagreement on the specific ranking is exactly the kind of foundation a fair final comparison needs to be built on. It confirms that this video is not manufacturing a controversy where none exists, since the underlying belief that this cast changed significantly over the years is clearly shared by a very large number of people who have spent real time thinking carefully about the show. At the same time, it confirms that reaching a specific, defensible answer to the question of which character changed the most requires more than simply repeating whatever the loudest or most common common opinion happens to be. It requires going back through each character's own specific journey, already laid out in detail across the earlier sections of this video, and weighing them fairly against each other using a clear and consistent standard, rather than simply picking whichever character happens to get mentioned most often in casual conversations about the show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. With this broader picture of fan and audience consensus now in place, alongside the individual character breakdowns already covered earlier, everything needed to reach a fair final verdict is finally sitting on the table. What remains is the actual work of comparing these different journeys directly against each other, weighing the size of each character's change against the number of directions that change moved through, and arriving at a clear, reasoned answer to the question this entire video set out to explore from its very first section. Section 10, The Verdict. Who morphed most and why it matters. Every character covered across this video changed in a way that can be pointed to, described, and backed up with specific episodes. Mr. Krabs moved from a flawed but balanced business owner into a character whose love of money crowded out nearly everything else about him. Patrick moved through several distinct stages, losing sharpness, gaining a colder edge, softening partway back, and then losing sharpness again in an even more extreme form. Squidward's own personality held together more than most, while the stories built around him narrowed into a smaller set of repeating situations, and the fairness of his suffering shifted along the way. Plankton moved almost entirely in the opposite direction from Krabs, softening from a genuine threat into a character many fans grew to root for. SpongeBob himself lost some of the sharper edges of his original personality and became less consistently aware of how his actions affected the people closest to him, even while his core skill as a fry cook stayed steady the whole time. Reaching a fair answer to which one of these characters changed the most requires picking a clear way to measure change in the first place, since these 5 stories do not all move in the same direction or through the same kind of process. 3 questions make the fairest starting point for that kind of comparison. First, how far did the character actually travel from where they started, measured by comparing their earliest, most grounded self against their most extreme, later self? Second, how much of the character's original personality got replaced rather than simply added to, since a character who gains one new extreme trait while keeping everything else intact has changed less than a character whose one trait grew large enough to push out most of what used to sit around it. Third, how consistent and long-lasting that extreme version actually was across the show's run, since a single unusual episode counts for less than a pattern repeated across many episodes and many years. Starting with Squidward, his case is the easiest to rule out as the strongest example of personal change, even though something genuinely did shift around him. His core personality, short-tempered, artistic, longing for peace and quiet, stayed remarkably stable across the entire show, according to multiple sources that specifically compared his Flanderization to the rest of the main cast, and found it noticeably smaller. What changed around him was less about who he is, and more about the shape of the stories built around him, along with how deserved his suffering felt from one era to the next. That is a real and interesting kind of change, but it is a change in narrative role rather than a change in personal identity, which makes it a weaker fit for the specific question this video set out to answer. SpongeBob presents a more complicated case, since real change clearly did happen to him, particularly in the stretch of seasons following the first movie. His early combination of genuine knowledge, real ambition, and occasional nervousness gave way to a simpler, more consistently naive version of himself, one whose obliviousness at times crossed into genuinely harming the people around him without much awareness of the consequences. At the same time, several sources describe later stretches of the show pulling his character back toward a version closer to his original balance, and his skill as a fry cook never wavered across any era of the show. This mix of real change alongside real stability, plus a documented partial recovery, places him solidly in the middle of this comparison, rather than at either extreme. Plankton's case deserves serious consideration, since the total distance he traveled from a genuine threat capable of taking over an entire town in the first movie to a character many fans grew to feel sorry for rather than fear is just as dramatic in scale as anything that happened to Mr. Krabs. What makes his case slightly different, though, is what actually actually changed underneath that shift. His core goal, stealing the secret formula to save his failing restaurant, never changed across the entire run of the show. His genuine care for Karen never changed either, staying steady through every version of his character described in this comparison. What shifted was mostly his success rate and how sympathetic his failures felt to the audience, especially once his rival grew harsher during the same years Plankton grew softer. This is a real and significant change in how audiences experienced watching him, but it is closer to a shift in fortune and tone than a full replacement of his underlying personality, which places him just below the very top of this ranking, despite the size of his overall reversal. This leaves Patrick and Mr. Krabs standing as the two strongest candidates, and both of them have a genuinely fair claim to the title this video set out to determine. The case for Patrick rests on the sheer number of distinct changes stacked on top of each other across his history. Unlike a character who shifted once and stayed that way, Patrick lost his early flashes of practical intelligence first, then gained a colder, more selfish streak that had little to do with intelligence at all, then softened partway back from that selfish streak, then lost his sharpness again in an even more extreme form during the show's 10th season. Adding up the total distance covered across all of these separate shifts arguably produces more overall movement than any single character on this list, since he did not just travel far in one direction, he traveled through several different versions of himself over the course of the show's history. The case for Mr. Krabs rests on a different kind of strength, one built around depth rather than number of stages. His change happened mostly in one clear direction, moving from a flawed but balanced boss with real business sense and real warmth toward his daughter into a character whose love of money became close to the entirety of his personality during a well-documented, multi-season stretch. The episode built around Krabbyland back in season 3 shows the show was capable of writing this extreme version of him early on, but treated it as an exception that ended with real consequences. The stretch running through seasons 6 to 10 turned that same extreme version into something closer to the default, most clearly shown in an episode where he tormented a rival to the point of a genuine breakdown and walked away from the situation with barely any consequence at all. This shift did not just add a new trait onto an already existing personality. It replaced the balance that used to define him, pushing out his sense of fairness in his rivalry with Plankton and much of the warmth he once showed toward the people around him, leaving one single quality standing in for almost the entire character. Weighing these two cases against each other, Mr. Krabs comes out as the stronger answer to the question this video has been building toward, though the reasoning behind that choice matters more than the answer itself. Patrick's journey covers more separate stages, but each individual stage, taken on its own, represents a smaller shift than what happened to Mr. Krabs during his defining stretch. Patrick's first shift made him less sharp without changing his kindness. His second shift made him colder without erasing his intelligence problem, simply adding a new problem alongside it. Mr. Krabs' shift did something more complete within a single sustained stretch of the show's history. It took one piece of an already established personality and let it grow large enough to consume nearly everything else that used to define him, transforming a flawed but recognizable boss into something much closer to a cartoon villain, with the clearest possible evidence being an entire episode built around him tormenting someone to the edge of a genuine crisis and facing no real consequence for it whatsoever. That kind of complete replacement, happening within one clearly documented stretch of the show rather than spread out across several smaller shifts, represents the deepest single transformation found anywhere in this comparison. None of this means Patrick's case is weak, or that reasonable people watching the same episodes described throughout this video could not land on a different final answer. A viewer who weighs total number of changes more heavily than depth of any single change might reasonably land on Patrick instead. A viewer who cares most about which character's reversal changed the emotional core of a relationship the most might land on Plankton, given how completely his shift flipped the entire dynamic between him and Mr. Krabs. What this video has tried to do is lay out each character's actual documented history clearly enough that any of these different final answers can be reached honestly, using using real evidence rather than simply repeating whatever opinion happens to be most common in casual conversation. Stepping back from the specific ranking, it is worth returning to the idea introduced at the very start of this video. None of this happened because anyone working on the show set out to ruin these characters on purpose. A long-running show built around a small cast of characters will naturally lean on whichever traits get the biggest reaction from an audience. And over enough years, across enough different writers, that natural leaning can slowly reshape a character far beyond where they originally started. Mr. Krabs' love of money made for an easy, reliable joke in Season 1, and that same reliability eventually turned into the foundation of an entirely different version of him several years later. The same basic process, different writers reaching for a proven trait again and again over time, shaped every character looked at in this comparison, even though it produced a different result for each one of them. Understanding this pattern changes how a rewatch of the show can feel. Instead of simply enjoying or disliking a particular season, it becomes possible to notice the specific moment a familiar character starts leaning a little harder into one part of themselves, and to trace exactly how that small shift eventually became something much larger. Mr. Krabs singing happily about his profits in a quiet Season 2 office scene, and Mr. Krabs disguising himself as his own daughter to torment a rival for 2 straight weeks, came from the same starting point, separated by years of small, repeated choices, rather than one single dramatic rewrite. That distance, small step by small step, is really what this whole comparison has been about, from its very first section onward, and Mr. Krabs, more clearly than anyone else standing beside him in Bikini Bottom, shows exactly how far that kind of distance can eventually stretch. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.